Hello, and welcome to Cruising Through History with Scott Cruz. My name is Xander. Scott, what are we cruising through today?
Well, today, Xander, I'm going to talk about the Harlem Renaissance.
Okay, Harlem Renaissance. So what time period are we thinking here?
Well, there's some disagreement, or whatever you want to call it, about when the time period. Most people put it at the 1910s to about the 1930s. But the major portion of it, a lot of it happened in the 1920s.
Okay, so roaring 20s time.
Yes, and it was interesting because in the 19th century, Harlem, the place itself, was actually an all-white neighborhood. But in the late 19th century in New York City, as they got a massive influx of European immigrants, a lot of those people moved farther north. So a lot of black residents who live farther, I don't know if you call it downtown in New York City, they saw this prime real estate and they started buying it up like in the 1910s. Mm-hmm. And that's how they established a neighborhood there. And that was before World War I. But it was also because of the Great Migration, which many of our listeners may know.
Okay.
It was a massive migration of African Americans from the South.
Oh, to populate cities in the north. And then that's when we talk about like things like white flight and suburbs were made.
Yes, and a lot of it was because in post-Civil War history in the South, it didn't turn out quite like they thought it might, especially for African Americans. Many were sharecroppers. They weren't allowed an education. They were subject to terrible forms of racism. And not that there wasn't racism in the North, there was, but a lot of them went north. And so the majority of them landed in Harlem. A lot of them went to Chicago, as we know, that's not too far from us. And so you had this great influx of people that came up from the South, and all these people were mixing, and they all had different experiences and whatnot. So a lot of that happened before World War I. So they came up, and Harlem was beginning to be established as a place to go, as a destination. In fact, there were 175,000 African Americans in Harlem.
Wow.
300,000 have come up through the Great Migration, and the majority, as you can tell from that number, went to Harlem.
Wow. That sounds like, 175,000. I mean, that's larger than, I want to say, actually, Kenosha County as a whole.
It was like a city within a borough.
Jeez.
So yeah.
So you get all those people crammed in together, and then we get this, and they're all different experiences, different walks of life.
Yes.
And I guess what all comes out of it? What?
Right, and it even started before World War I. I guess music, literature, theater. There was a whole new movement, and of course you can even go back to, there were differences in opinion though on how African Americans should advance. You had Booker T. Washington, or in an earlier time, who a lot of people thought he was too accommodating, like we'll work for whites and we'll do this if they guarantee our rights. But he also believed in education, mostly industrial and agricultural, but he was working with residents of the South who were still farmers and that. And so W.E.B. Du Bois, who had come from this too, he thought, no, blacks should have the same, political rights and civil rights and the same kind of education that whites were getting. In those days, that meant like classical education, like in universities and things of that nature. So there was some difference there. And but that sort of laid the seeds for this, because blacks started thinking, if we want to become full citizens, we just have to sort of be, not militant, because that word gets used and it gets used pejoratively, unfortunately, in some cases. But people will say, we have to assert ourselves. We have to get them. We have to take them.
Yeah, it's like raising by your bootstraps.
Yes,
that's kind of the idea.
Right. And so, and then there was like Marcus Garvey, but he came from Jamaica, so he wasn't American. He came to. That's another thing about this. A lot of people from like the Caribbean and stuff had come to Harlem as well. So you sort of had these other viewpoints. And Marcus Garvey, he believed in separation, and Du Bois didn't believe in that. And so you had these three things, and these things going on, and this was like in the early 20th century. I mean, Du Bois wrote his book, The Souls of Black Folks, like in 1903. Mm-hmm. So that's what happened there. And I think the Great Migration was a big catalyst for a lot of this. So was the war itself, because, as you know, the military was still segregated. But one of the units that fought in World War I was called the Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th Infantry Regiment. I can say that. They spent 191 days in frontline trenches, and they had 1,500 casualties, and that was the most of any American unit.
Of course.
Right.
Like, it's just, of course that would be the case.
Yes. A mixture of valor and the fact that they said, just put them at the front, because that happened a lot. So, but when they came home, they came home to segregation, and then you also had terrible race riots in the wake of World War I, East St. Louis in 1917, Tulsa, which is, I hate to say famous one, but yeah, it is, 1921. So all these things were going on, and I think, so these movements started, I think, just kind of slowly, but they were coming about. And when World War I happened, that's when I think it became more of an issue, because you were getting, heavy lynchings and all this terrible stuff was going on. And I think people were like, we're going to see if we do this a little differently.
So it's all of these moving parts, because you got four major Black philosophers, essentially.
Yes.
Who all have different ideas, and this is like pre-hand. They come together. Well, they don't come together. They have these opposing ideas, right. But then as the Great War happens and people migrate through the Great Migration to different areas, and they combine these experiences, different viewpoints, all of that, it's kind of this kind of boom of, this is where like culture is born, essentially.
Yes.
Like building that own identity of themselves, and that's kind of where all the arts and all that we know of, the jazz, the poetry, the philosophy comes from. It's almost like its own little Bohemia sort of idea.
And the interesting thing is, especially music, so not only was something happening in Harlem, but you can go to New Orleans in the early 20th century and jazz is starting to happen. And it's really with an artist like Louis Armstrong where it starts to become bigger. And actually Armstrong left New Orleans in the early 1920s. He went to Chicago, and then by the mid-20s he was in New York, so he was there too. But you get this, you get all these jazz musicians who have come up from the South, like Sidney Bechet, Jelly Roll Morton, Louis Armstrong, and I think that starts to spread it too.
Yeah, and jazz itself is being founded during this time, of course.
Yes.
Is so interesting because it's, for one, like the American music style, like created in the U.S.
Yeah.
And I always think when I was in school, I thought I was in jazz band for a little bit.
Oh.
I'm like, sheet music, syncopation, all of that fun stuff. And now then I hear the origins of jazz, like it's completely free form, freestyle expression, and you're like, wow. And then that jazz in New Orleans was about that free form, free expression, which was completely denied of the folks doing it. And then that's spreading through the Renaissance too.
But it really, before I'd like to mention a gentleman named James Reese Europe. Now, he was a musician. In 1910, he organized a thing called the Clef Club, which was a band. And he played ragtime, an early form of, I guess they called it proto-jazz. And he's kind of forgotten today in a lot of ways, and I will explain why, most likely. And in 1912, he played Carnegie Hall with his band, which was African-American. There were no whites in the band.
Yeah.
And he played there, and he only would play music written solely by black composers. And so he really had that. And he made a series of recordings in 1913 and 1914. But then he went off to fight in the war with the Harlem Hellfighters. Now, the interesting thing about that is when he was sent to France, him and his band would perform for the troops and for the French. Now, we all know that in the history of jazz, it sort of has this connection to France. When we think of Charlie Parker, we think of I just had it. I'm sorry. Charlie Parker. Oh, Miles Davis. He was in Paris for a while. How could I forget him?
I'm like, wait. As soon as you say it, I got it.
And so he would, in fact, one of his band members, there was this sort of craze in France after he was there. One of his band members said he spread ragtime-itis to the French people. And I think he was really on the verge of, I think he would have fit into the whole scene that was going on at the time, but unfortunately in 1919 he was stabbed to death by one of his band members, he was the leader of the band. It was someone who played in the band with him. He was stabbed in the neck and he bled to death, and he was 38. And I was just thinking of this, it's kind of, you kind of twinge a little, because it's like, wow, what could have been, because I think he was doing some of this even before some of the other ones started going. But it went, and even you had Ma Rainey, some of these blues singers that were, and that's another thing that came out of this.
Oh yeah, yep. The blues.
I was thinking about this when I was researching this. Is you had the jazz from New Orleans, and the Great Migration also, I think, was a catalyst for the blues that moved, especially to Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the early blues musicians that started playing, and they were recorded. In fact, sometimes you hear this in jazz, like Louis Armstrong has a lot of early songs called, the such and such blues, or the such and such blues.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think they're kind of crossing, and so it's going out.
Yeah.
And you start to have the beginning of recorded music, which you didn't have before.
Mm-hmm.
So now people can play these records in their parlor with one of those old cranky deals, the Victrola, and sell tons of records, and they did. Especially there was a label called OK Records that recorded a lot of these bands, and so yeah, that I always thought that's interesting that you had this migration of people, but they all brought those traditions with them, and they all kind of gelled.
Yeah, and a lot of that gelling kind of. And you said this already, you said 175,000 people in that just Harlem area itself.
Right.
And now we know the Harlem Renaissance is, of course, named after, Harlem.
Right.
I imagine, Harlem must have kept people somehow. They stayed there for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
What, I guess, did all of this kind of coming together make people stay? What kept people developing?
That's a good question. I think the fact that New York, which we've talked about before, some of our other...
We'll get out of New York eventually.
Sort of our other podcast was, it was the publishing capital of the world at the time, and it was the entertainment media. So, there was a journal called Opportunity, which was published by the National Urban League. The NAACP had the Crisis. So that was published by the National Urban League. And they had a sort of party or get together, something like 1924, where they were able to bring together a lot of these writers with white publishers.
Mm-hmm.
And because there were so few places that would take mixed people, they could only have it at certain places. And so that helped too. And but really, it starts with a lot of us say, well, it started in literature. It started with a book by a man named Alain Locke. I think I'm saying that right. If I'm saying it wrong, I apologize. And he wrote a book, or he put together a book, edited a book called The New Negro. Now I use that term. I know it's not a term we use any longer, but that's what he called his book. Okay. And that's what the Harlem Renaissance was originally called, the New Negro movement. That's just what it was called. I apologize. I know it's a word that's out of fashion, and I won't use it a lot, but that's what it was called. And it was an anthology of a collection of essays and fiction, and written by people like Langston Hughes, mm-hmm. and Zora Neale Hurston. was in there.
Those are two big ones.
Yeah.
Like when we think like Harlem Renaissance writers, I know those two come in my head immediately. So.
Right. Yeah. In fact, me too. So that's why I mentioned that, because yeah.
So it's almost like when we think about New York, people go to New York for the arts. Like even today, I hear people like, I'm gonna go to New York and live my dreams. The kind of naive freshman English major, kind of right. I'm gonna go in a publishing house in New York, or right. music in New York, or even Chicago, LA, something like that. Mm-hmm. New York is still that place.
Yes.
Harlem Renaissance kind of is I'm calling the Harlem Renaissance a throwback to today. But it's like today's like a throwback to Harlem Renaissance's great movement. People still go to New York for moving to the arts, to gather with people, like-minded people.
Right. And I don't think you're way wrong there. I think, well, not way wrong. I don't think you're wrong at all. I don't know where that came from.
Of course I'm wrong.
Because I see it the same way. I think it's, we have this event called the Harlem Renaissance, if you want to date it or something. But I think you still see it today. I think, and the influence that African American music has had on the rest of the culture.
Blues, swing,
jazz,
rap,
hip hop, rock and roll.
Rap
gospel.
And hip hop. Didn't think about, gospel.
So you could even make an argument that some of the early country music was inspired by African American music, because a lot of it was gospel. That's where they learned to sing in church. Mm-hmm. And so, and you see that with, like I said, rap and rock and roll. I mean, you sort of get this cycle. We have these early blues musicians, let's say like Robert Johnson or Son House, and then later you get Muddy Waters and you get Buddy Guy and that kind of thing, and it just sort of keeps. And then they influence all the British musicians. I mean, that's where a lot of, I like the Rolling Stones. When I was younger, I didn't know who Robert Johnson was until I was in the Rolling Stones, and I'm thinking, who wrote that song? I didn't know who any of these, I didn't know who Muddy Waters was until I listened to the Rolling Stones. And so, yeah, and there's a lot of appropriation, but it's also, for better or for worse, that's how I discovered those things. Mm-hmm. Living in Racine or whatever, So I think it still churns, it still goes on, and despite of people trying to stop it, I think it still happens,
Yeah. And I'm even thinking, when you're listing off music styles, I was thinking, it's like, I should probably look into the origins of slam poetry. Like,
oh yeah,
I'm guessing, because if you read Langston Hughes or Zora Neale Hurston, oh wow, I butchered that. You read their works, and they have that lyrical sense to them. Mm-hmm. They can have that sort of, they have their own beat to them that's jazz-like. There's a certain freedom in it, and it right. translates well to spoken word.
Yes, in fact, they call it jazz poetry.
Mm-hmm.
Langston Hughes is very much influenced by Louis Armstrong.
Yeah.
And so that's when you read it. You're right. It has this sort of singing quality to it.
It's definitely interesting, and slam poetry or jazz poetry. What however you word it.
Right. Right.
Still, that's still a thing that happens. People just get together and do it. Like,
well, we call it riffing. Whether it's with an instrument or you're doing it with words. You're still doing it. So. But yeah, Langston Hughes. In fact, he did say that the one thing, there was some pushback a little bit in the late 20s, and there probably still is, on this whole thing. Like one of the writers who was involved in the Harlem Renaissance, and for some reason his name is escaping me. Later, he wrote that he thought maybe that term was a white invention, that there all these things were coming, even in the 19th century, and so. But Langston Hughes, he sort of said, it's an expression of our individual dark-skinned selves, and I think a lot of them felt they couldn't do that before, and that here they were representing themselves as this is who we are, and we're not a caricature, which I think is very important in this. When I'm reading a lot of this stuff, that pops up a lot, especially in theater. It started like in theater in 1917. There was a play written by a man named Ridgely Torrance, who ironically was white, but he actually wrote plays for black actors and casts. So he refurbished one of his earlier plays, and then he wrote one. He wrote a series of plays, 3 plays for the Negro Theater in 1917, and it was all black cast. And that's where, and it was, and how they looked at it was, this was our way of expressing ourselves with dignity. It wasn't minstrelly, it wasn't, that kind of thing, which I think is, and so some of them even started, this is a great leap in black theater, because we're actually presenting ourselves as human beings. And I think that's what it kind of came down to. And I see that theme in a lot of this, like, hey, we're human beings just like you.
Yeah.
We're not caricatures. And, it's not Birth of a Nation. And no one saw that I just cringed a little bit, but it's not that. That's what I'm saying.
Well, I mean, the most appropriate term here is, Renaissance, because the Renaissance is its own historical thing to it.
It's really a rebirth. That's really pretty much what it means.
And this was a specifically African American rebirth, what I think is the idea, because this is them being themselves, like you quoted Langston Hughes, being our own black-skinned selves or dark-skinned selves. Like, that is the point. The rebirth of that after generations of indignities.
Yes.
So Renaissance really is the most appropriate word.
Right, and I would say that that's what you still see even in music now. This is who we are, or this is who I am, and I'm no different than that person expressing themselves. And here we go. I guess.
And the first person I think of right there is Lil Nas X. His album came out recently.
Yeah, someone will have to help me with some.
Oh boy, we're gonna, after the podcast recording, we're just gonna sit in a room and you're gonna listen to Montreux right now.
But yeah, it is interesting, the influences that, and I always think that it still happens. And I was just thinking of this, as a, then you can get some copying or appropriation, like Pat Boone singing Tutti Frutti, which is sort of an abomination.
I'm glad you recognize that.
but what happened was Harlem became this place to go for whites too, because they wanted to go down and see what was happening. So you had the Cotton Club, the Savoy Ballroom, and these places started getting a lot of business. Now, it's a fine line between I want to go down into the scene and then kind of voyeurism, like let's go down and observe, like it's some kind of anthropological thing. Let's observe everybody here. So I know it's a fine line, but a lot of whites did get interested in this. And I mean, heck, the 1920s was called the Jazz Age.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty good, because that's the music that people were listening to. And I always get this. The Charleston was a dance that came out of jazz. Tap dancing was started then, and
really,
I always get, well, not started, but it came out of
popularized.
Popularized, right? But I always get this. People always think of the 1920s, and you always think of people speeding down the road in a jalopy with bathtub gin flying around, and people doing the Charleston on top of flagpoles, and nobody could see this, but I just sort of did the Charleston thing on my legs. But anyway,
it was a very interesting observation to me. It was like, okay, got a little move.
But yes, but I think it's all those things that helped that along, and there were females, like I said, there was Ma Rainey, which there was just a movie about Ma Rainey based on a play that came out in the early '80s, Ma Rainey and the Black Bottom, and so these people are still alive with us. I mean, not alive, but culturally they still live. And I wrote some of the other ones down too. Ma Rainey was a blues singer. Bessie Smith and Mamie Smith were both the original blues singers. Then Billie Holiday, her tragic life, she came about. And then you look at, again, the influences. There's Billie Holiday, then it goes to Diane, you have Diane Ross, and it just sort of spills out. And I think it's all part of that. Yeah. So.
what a what a time period, because that's it's weird. It's weird to think how a lot of modern artistic expression came from this time period, particularly.
Right, and I mean, and we're just scratching the surface. I talked a lot today about music.
Mm-hmm.
I bet there's art, there's painting, there's sculpture. Richmond Barthay, I think I said his name right. Aaron Douglas was one of the best Harlem Renaissance painters, because again, they painted in a different style. They used more of a black aesthetic than previous artists had done. So again, there's that consciousness of that,
mm-hmm.
and that's what I think propels a lot of this. And but unfortunately, by the 1930s, it all kind of ended, or the mid-30s, because of the Depression.
Yeah, Depression, World War II.
World War II. And Harlem was a great center for black businesses. I mean, they had black publishing houses. All these were owned by African Americans, and of course the Depression hit them just like everybody else. And the Depression really hurt the record industry too. And it did during World War II, because the items needed to make records were needed for the war. Shellac, I think it was. And so, I mean, people will go now and say, there were all these, Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker all played together in this time period, but there's no recordings because there were no records. I wonder what it sounded like. I think it's hard for us to, sort of put that in our mind with all the, everything's digital now.
Yeah.
And you store stuff. You don't need a big wax disc to put stuff on. But I do.
They're making a resurgence, though.
Yes, they are. Albums are, and that's good, because album art was always really good too. But I always get this picture of Louis Armstrong recording, and at that time they had like these big like megaphone type dealies where you would play your instrument into it and then it would cut it into the thing. Well, he was so powerful he had to stand in the hallway and they ran it out there because it would, if they stood with everybody else, would overpower everybody else on the recording.
Wow.
So, but like I said, I think here we've only scratched the surface. I mean, we could talk about Fats Waller, who was a progenitor of what was called the Harlem Stride piano, which people still play today. And like I said, we didn't even talk about writing all that much, and there was there's so much literature. Yes, that's one thing I learned from doing this. There were some people I've never heard of, and I'm glad I did this, because then I know who they are now, and that their contributions too. I mean, we know the big ones,
mm-hmm.
and but yeah, it was quite something when I was doing this, because I was trying to figure out, do I talk about this? I don't want to give slight to this, but I guess it's just how, but I just think culturally it's what flourished. Yeah. And it was able to, because of and I still think it goes back to the Great Migration, because all that talent, if you will, came from the South, and there it was. So I think I think we still live with it, and it's still with us, luckily. I don't know much about Lil Nas X, so
yeah, we're gonna get there right in just a few minutes.
I know a lot about Louis Armstrong, so I can talk about that. And
oh my gosh, I'm imagining someone listening to this now and just like, this guy did not know who Lil Nas X is.
Well, I should say I know who he is. I just don't know much of that music.
So, Scott,
I know Jimi Hendrix.
All right. Someone's gonna give you a plus for that. A little plus mark. So Scott, where are we cruising to next week?
Well, next time we're going to talk about World War I again, but this time its influence on modern horror.
Oh,
like films, mostly horror films.
Okay.
But the genre itself, it had an influence, and so it'll kind of roll out of what we were talking about here, sort of cultural things, and that'll be interesting, I hope. And so that's what we'll be talking about next time.
Okay. Well, thank you.